Welcome to Still Unbelievable, a podcast by Reason Press, where we examine religious claims, especially those made by Christians, and we regularly respond to items that are featured on the podcast Unbelievable. We embrace dialogue, but as skeptical former believers, we will also criticise unfounded claims and unsupported beliefs. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable, this time a few weeks after Easter and we're still in lockdown. We're talking with Jonathan McLatchie, who was on a recent episode of the Unbelievable podcast with a friend of Andrew's and mine, David from Skeptics and Seekers. So Jonathan McLatchie, PhD, founder of the Apologetics Academy and also assistant professor of biology at Sattler College. Thank you very much for joining us, Jonathan.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And the reason why I asked you on to this show was I did hear you on Unbelievable. I enjoyed the show. For me personally, there were a few bits I didn't quite fully understand your position or what was said. And so what I wanted to do was I asked if you would come on and you could have a conversation with myself and Andrew to expand those ideas. You very kindly emailed me back within minutes, I think it was, to say you'd love to. So thank you very much for that prompt response. So here we are a week or so after the conversation aired, although I understand it was actually recorded a couple of months ago now. So the reason mainly why I wanted to get you on was talk about the subjects that you raised right at the beginning of the conversation with David on Unbelievable. And that was about your justification for the resurrection, about the evidences. And there were two things in specific that caught my attention. One was you made reference to using Bayes to justify or to raise the probability of the resurrection happening. And the other one was that you said that you use a cumulative case methodology to gather many pieces of evidence to effectively have one big pile of good evidence. Please correct me if I'm misrepresenting you. So those are the two bits that caught my attention and why I wanted to talk. So if we could have a talk around that and we'll see where else the conversation goes. I have a question from a Christian that I'd like to throw at you later on in the episode, which we've already discussed. So I guess how I'd like to open the show really is, why do you believe the resurrection of Jesus happened as described in the Gospels, and why should I believe it too?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So there's really four mutually exhaustive contending hypotheses which purport to explain the pertinent evidence concerning the resurrection of Jesus. Those would be number one, that the disciples never in fact claimed Jesus rose from the dead. It's a later developing myth, and it would have been a surprise as anyone else to hear the claim that Jesus had been raised from the dead. A second contending hypothesis is that the disciples did in fact claim that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them, but they lied about it. They deliberately set out to deceive others into believing that he rose again. A third contending hypothesis is that they did in fact claim Jesus rose from the dead, but they were sincerely mistaken in believing that Jesus rose from the dead. And under that umbrella would come hypotheses such as the hallucination hypothesis or some sort of objective vision hypothesis, etc. And finally, the hypothesis which I myself entertain, which is that Jesus really did rise from the dead, and that explains the disciples' claim that Jesus had appeared to them alive following his death. So let me just articulate just one or two reasons to defend the proposition that in fact the disciples themselves claimed Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to them. It's not a later developing myth or legend that arose much later. So if we go over to 1 Corinthians, and 1 Corinthians was written by the Apostle Paul from Ephesus in the early to mid 50s AD, and Corinth was the capital of Achaia, and what we now know as Greece. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in verses 3 through 8, he passes on to the Corinthians what many scholars believe to be a creedal tradition from the early years of the Christian church. He writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. And so most scholars are persuaded that this is not something that Paul himself has come up with, but is in fact an oral tradition, or a creed, if you will, that he's picked up from the Jerusalem leadership. Some scholars have entertained the idea or speculated that perhaps Paul received this creed upon his visit to Jerusalem, as mentioned in Galatians chapter 1, 3 years following his conversion, where he meets with Peter and James and other people mentioned in that creed. I personally don't think the evidence is conclusive on that, although I think it's quite plausible. However, I think irrespective of whether that's so or not, I think we can still make a solid argument from this text that the proclamation concerning the resurrection goes back to the early apostles. So notice what Paul goes on to say next. He says, verse 8, he says, "Last of all, he appeared to me also as to one untimely born." And then verse 9, he says, "For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, and so you believed." And so he thus assumes there, notice that last verse, verse 11, "Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, and so you believed." So he thus assumes that the Corinthian Christians understand his proclamation of the resurrection to be consistent with what's already been proclaimed by the Jerusalem eldership, in particular Peter and James, the 12, and so forth. And we also have independent attestation to the fact that the Corinthians were familiar and acquainted with the preaching of the Apostle Peter, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul mentions that there were divisions and factions in the midst of the Corinthians. Some say, "I follow Cephas," others Apollos, others, "I follow Paul," others, "I follow Christ." And so that also entails that the Corinthians must have been familiar and acquainted with the preaching of Peter. And just in a nutshell, as I wrap up, we then move to then evaluate or adjudicate between the remaining contending hypotheses. So what explains the origins of this claim on the part of the apostles? Is it that they made it up deliberately and set out to deceive people? Or is it that they were honestly mistaken? Or is it that Jesus really did rise from the dead? Well, the hypothesis that they were honestly mistaken seems to be ruled out or argued strongly against by several pieces of evidence. Let me just give you one, and that is that the claims concerning the resurrection in the Gospels, which I would maintain go back to eyewitness testimony, are multi-sensory in nature. That is to say that they involve multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, physical contact with Jesus. And according to Acts chapter 1, it was extended across 40 days. So it wasn't just one brief and confusing episode. And so that's the sort of thing that's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about. And as to the hypothesis that they were deliberately lying or setting out to deceive people, that's also argued against, I think, strongly on the basis of several pieces of evidence. I will just give you one to begin with, and that is that the apostles were willing to suffer and in many cases even die for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead, which was a linchpin of their Christian faith. So in terms of the evidence supporting their martyrdom, we have, for example, the martyrdom of Peter is attested by two first-century sources and several second-century sources. The two first-century sources attesting his martyrdom are Clement of Rome, who wrote, according to most scholars, around AD 96. He was the bishop of the church in Rome, writing to the Corinthian Christians. And the other source would be John 21, which anticipates Peter's death, where Jesus actually predicts it following the resurrection. And if John was writing around 90 to 95 AD, which is where most scholars place him, then it would be very unlikely for him to insert that prediction had it not actually happened in the way that he described. And in terms of the martyrdom of James, the Lord's brother, we have a first-century source, namely Flavius Josephus, in volume 20 of Antiquities of the Jews, which attests to his martyrdom by stoning as the leader of the Jerusalem church. So that would be the argument in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot more to flesh out, but that would be a good place to start.
Thank you. I didn't expect you to go to that verse in Corinthians about where the evidences are, or rather the visitations of Jesus post-resurrection. But I guess it kind of makes sense because if you're going to have a resurrection, you're going to need people to testify to it. So the challenge and the difficulty that I have with those verses in the first few verses in 1 Corinthians 15 is they're kind of sweeping, and there's not a lot of detail in those. It says Jesus appeared here and there, and specifically the 500. I appreciate that there are others before and after the 500, but it's just there, but there's no detail. I don't know where that visitation to the 500 was. I don't know any of the people who were in that 500. So it, to me, on reading that on face value, it feels like something that's thrown in there, but very, very difficult to get any kind of confirmatory detail out of. So when you go through your list of hypotheses of what could have happened, I'm not brave enough to pin myself to any one of those hypotheses. And the reason why I don't do that is because I genuinely don't have enough information to be able to suggest a hypothesis. All I can say is I don't have enough information to believe any of these things that are claimed to be facts. So therefore, I also don't have enough information to suggest an alternative. I just know that I don't have enough to believe any of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very fair point. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons why I'm quite critical of the so-called minimal facts approach to arguing for the resurrection. And that is because I think that when we place too much weight on the 1 Corinthians 15 text in isolation, then it becomes very difficult to evaluate the rationality of the apostles' belief in the resurrection, precisely for the reason that you gave, that there's not a lot of detail. The appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, for the most part, seem to me to be consistent with the hypothesis of objective vision or some sort of hallucinatory experience, etc. I think, though, that when you combine this argument with other independent evidence coming from the Gospels and Acts specifically, I think that you have a greatly strengthened argument for the resurrection. So, for instance, the author of the book of Acts, his name was Luke. There's about a 50-50 split in scholarship as to whether Luke actually was the author, but it's irrelevant to the point. But I personally think that the author was Luke on the basis of the evidence. But there is nonetheless, irrespective of whether Luke himself was the author, as I think he was, there is overwhelming evidence that the author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul, and in particular that he was present with Paul upon Paul's visit to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 21, where he meets with the Jerusalem eldership, including James specifically is mentioned there in Acts chapter 21. I'm happy to go into the evidence for Luke's presence there, but you're familiar with, I'm sure, the use of the plural pronoun starting in chapter 16, where Luke actually claims to be a traveling companion of Paul, claims that he was actually present there with Paul, and I think there's good attestation of that independent of Luke's own claim. If Luke really was present with Paul in Acts 21, then he met with the Jerusalem elders. In fact, Luke was imprisoned along with Paul in Caesarea, which is quite close to Jerusalem, and so would have ample access to that treasure trove of living witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. So was Luke in a position to know that what the apostles were claiming concerning the resurrection? Yes, I think he was in a position to know, because he was personally acquainted with the Jerusalem leadership, Peter, James, and so forth. In the book of Acts, in chapter number 2, he mentions Peter's statement, Peter's preaching at Pentecost, some 50 days after the resurrection. And Peter says to the crowd, "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence," this is verse 29, "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he should set one of his descendants on the throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we all are witnesses." And so Peter there claims to be a witness, a living witness of the resurrection of Christ. In fact, in Acts chapter 1, Luke tells us that Jesus' resurrection appearances were extended across a 40-day time period. And also Luke 24 also talks about the polymodal character of the resurrection experiences as well, the appearances to the disciples and so forth, which were very physical in nature. And since Luke shows himself time and time again to be a very faithful and reliable historian who's a habitual truth teller and had access to the living witnesses of the resurrection, I think that we have good reason to think that this was in fact what the claim was concerning the resurrection experiences.
So, Jonathan, if you don't mind, I'm going to change the subject just briefly to martyrdom, because you also mentioned martyrdom, and I don't want to get too far away before that becomes irrelevant to the conversation, if you see what I mean. So you also mentioned martyrdom, and for myself, I've never been terribly convinced by martyrdom. So as a little more about me, I've got a background in Christian education. I attended a Christian university. I was a preacher for a while, blah, blah, blah. And I'll try not to bore you with all of the details or anybody that's heard my story repeatedly. So, but even in my days in university when I was taking Bible classes, I was not convinced by martyrdom. Because it struck me even then that people will die for all kinds of reasons that are much less sufficient than martyrdom, much less sufficient than a strongly held belief. And so to say that someone has a strongly held belief and they were willing to die for it doesn't strike me at all surprising, because people are willing to die for things that are much less substantial. People will play chicken on Saturday night in cars, or at least they did in the region of the country that I grew up in, right? And so I don't find martyrdom to be at all a good argument in regard to why I should accept testimony from 1 Corinthians or Acts or any other book in the Bible, any one of the 66, because we don't seem on a particularly individual basis to hold human life all that dear.
Okay, that's a great point. And I think that the point relating to the martyrdom of the apostles is that it's more expected on the hypothesis of sincerity than it is on the hypothesis of conspiracy. So few people are willing to die for something that they know to be a lie. People are willing all the time to die for something they believe to be true, but there are not many people that are willing to die for something that they know to be a lie. And so it's evidence for sincerity in the sense that it's more probable on the hypothesis of sincerity than it is on the hypothesis of conspiracy. And so it forms part of a cumulative case. It's not an argument that I rest the whole edifice of my argument on, but I think it is a contributing piece of evidence to the sincerity of the apostles. I'll just give one more piece of evidence which would also contribute to that case for the sincerity of the apostles in terms of the numerous points of substantiation and corroboration of the gospel account. I don't have time to develop right now. I'm happy to do so in due course if you wish. And then the hypothesis that they were honestly mistaken is also, I think, argued against strongly on various grounds. So independent of the polymodal experience of the apostles, we have in 1 Corinthians 15, it says that Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. Well, what does that phrase mean, in accordance with the scriptures? Paul also talks in 1 Corinthians 15 about Christ being the first fruits among those who have fallen asleep, talking about Christ being the fulfillment of the first fruits feast. And I think that's actually what he's getting at when he says that Christ is raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And when we go over to Leviticus 23, we hear about the Feast of First Fruits, which is prescribed by Moses. And he says that the Feast of First Fruits is to be commemorated or celebrated on the day following the first Sabbath following Passover. So it's an interesting coincidence then that Christ's death, which is said to fulfill the Feast of First Fruits, happens to coincide with the Feast of Passover, with the Feast of First Fruits. And so that contributes an extra layer of evidence to the hypothesis that, or contributes an extra layer of evidence against the hypothesis that the disciples were honestly mistaken, and points towards design, either on the part of the human authors who manufactured this correspondence with this Feast of First Fruits, or on the part of God supernaturally raising Jesus from the dead on that Sunday. And then the hypothesis that the disciples were deliberately lying, I think, is also argued against strongly on the grounds that they were willing to die as martyrs, which isn't conclusive proof, but it is evidence for that hypothesis, and also the evidence from the general reliability of the gospel reports, which I think are rooted and grounded in credible eyewitness testimony.
So, no doubt we could have quite a long show about the reliability of eyewitness testimony. I'll try not to go there, because I think most people are familiar with the problems of eyewitness testimony, and hopefully we can do something. Hopefully we can maintain a conversation that's more interesting than talking about the wide range of problems with eyewitness testimony, right? So let me start in a slightly different place then, and just see if we can agree that sincere conviction does not equal truth in regard to the proposition. So I can be sincerely convinced of a thing that is in fact false. We can't agree with that with each other, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. I figured we could. I mean, this is quite a reasonable conversation so far. So when you say multimodal experience, I get exactly what you mean. The sight, the sound, the taste, the touch, all of the senses are involved. I think I left out hearing. But, so I get that when you talk about a multimodal experience, you're saying the disciples really believe that they were in the presence of a risen Jesus, right? Now, I think there are some problems, though. That is that there's pretty clear versing that quite a number didn't recognize this supposed risen Jesus, right? And beyond that, a multimodal experience actually suggests more to me that there was not a person that died and came back from the dead. And I would be willing to defend that ground on the basis that we live every day and we don't encounter risen people with whom we have multimodal experience.
Sorry, say that last bit again?
So in our normal course of events, you and I, when we walk around, we don't encounter people who have risen from the dead. So we don't have multimodal experience today. That is, you and I don't interact with a lot of people who have risen from the dead. So it seems to me that on balance of the evidence today, that we simply don't have people walking around who have risen from the dead.
Right.
It is much more likely that we are talking about a sincere wrong rather than an actual resurrection. I know we're going to have to unpack that, but I think that would be the ground I would defend.
Yes.
In response to what you've said.
So on that point about not seeing people that have been raised from the dead on a routine daily in a routine daily experience, that point would pertain to adjudicating the prior probability of the resurrection, right?
Yes, because if we don't, so I'm glad you've gotten there. I will try not to turn this into a Bayes discussion, though we can, because software people, right? Blah, 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 machine learning, yada, yada, yada. But I think to ignore the fact that we don't have a lot of evidence for resurrection would be to commit the base rate fallacy and not to ask the right question and say, well, on balance, what is the likelihood that this one person was raised from the dead, right? Because if we don't ask that question in regard to our regular experience, we're committing the base rate fallacy.
So the first point I would make in regards to that is that any proposition which has a non-zero prior probability, and I did mention this in the debate on Unbelievable, can in principle be demonstrated if you have sufficient evidence relative to that prior probability. So I made the point, for example, in the debate that Tim and Lydia McGrew actually published a chapter contribution in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology where they assume an absurdly low prior probability of the resurrection as 10 to the minus 40. And they still calculate a posterior odds of 0.9999, and based upon the assumptions that they plug into the odds form of Bayes' theorem. So in principle, you can provide sufficient evidence for any claim if the prior probability is non-zero. So a probability of zero would include something like a married bachelor, which there's absolutely no amount of evidence could substantiate. But you can, in principle, provide sufficient evidence for any proposition which is logically possible.
Right. So, look, we agree there. And the trouble is that it does appear to be a contradiction, other than through religious writing, to make the claim of a dead person rising. So you talked about a married bachelor being a contradiction. I agree. And it seems to be equally contradictory based on my experience that people rise from the dead after 3 days of death due to some miraculous experience. That seems to me to be absolutely equivalently contradictory.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of singularities which happen once, hence they're singularities, but we nonetheless have good reason to think they happened, right?
Yeah, sure, of course. And we can talk about singularities, although when we start there, we start to lose good footing for a Bayesian analysis, because Bayes is at its best when we are comparing large bodies of evidence. So, yes, there are singularities, but you invited me to consider contradiction. And so what I was reporting back for this discussion is that married bachelor is as contradictory to me as dead risen. And so you're still at a point where you have to prove that this single event is not contradictory. And in my view, at this point, it's as contradictory as a married bachelor.
Well, someone rising from the dead doesn't entail a logical contradiction, does it? Or you need to demonstrate that or point out the contradiction. But I don't see any logical contradiction in someone rising from the dead.
You don't?
No.
So other than this, so where have you seen someone rise from the dead? Now, I know you've got literature on it. I'm asking a 3-day dead person. Where have you seen that? In what sense can you reproduce it so that we're not talking about a contradiction? We are talking about something that's just rare.
Well, I mean, observing someone rising from the dead or observing a particular phenomenon is not how you adjudicate a prior probability, is it? So, or is
well, it may be. That may be one. It may absolutely be one way to adjudicate a prior probability.
You're right, but it isn't one way to adjudicate a prior probability of non-zero. So, for something to have a prior probability of 0, then it has to entail some sort of logical contradiction, like a married bachelor, or someone being dead and alive at the same time would also, if you mean in the same sense, dead and alive at the same time, then that would entail a logical contradiction. But someone being dead and then being alive again does not entail any contradiction, and so the prior probability is certainly not 0.
Well, I don't know whether it does or not. Here's why I say I don't know whether it entails a logical contradiction or not. There are all sorts of statements that we can make, and without the ability to test them, we don't know whether they imply a logical contradiction or not. You've said that there's not a logical contradiction in someone rising from the dead after 3 days. I've said I don't have any evidence for that other than a religious writing. You've then doubled down and said, but that doesn't imply a logical contradiction in the same sense that being alive and dead at the same time does. By the way, I agree that alive and dead is the equivalent to married bachelor, just to get that out of the way. So that was well spotted, and I agree completely. But I am not therefore required to accept that rising after 3 days is somehow not logically contradictory, because we don't know, without being able to test that idea, that the world provides a mechanism for rising after 3 days. And if you say, but it's outside the realm of nature, then yes, we're even further into ground that I think is probably contradictory.
Well, there's a difference, though, between physical possibility and logical possibility, right? So something can be physically impossible because there's no law of nature which accommodates it. But for something to be logically contradictory, the law of non-contradiction, which is one of the 3 laws of logic, states that something cannot be A or non-A at the same time in the same sense. So by that token, as you said, someone being dead and alive at the same time, if you mean dead and alive in the same sense, then
that's A and not A. Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's equivalent to A and non-A. But someone being dead and then being alive is not equivalent to that at all.
Right. But whether they are logically equivalent or not, if there is no physical mechanism for allowing someone to rise after 3 days, it doesn't matter whether it was logically contradictory. It matters whether it was physically contradictory. Because there may be all sorts of things in the world that are compatible logically speaking, that simply aren't physically possible. And so what I'm asking you to do is to prove that being able to rise after 3 days is actually physically possible and not a logical, irrespective of logical contradiction.
The point, though, is that no one's claiming that Christ rose physically no one's claiming that Christ rose from the dead by physical means, by material naturalistic law, right? We're claiming that Jesus was raised from the dead supernaturally by God.
Right, which is, and I said, then in that case, it seems to me to be even more contradictory, and therefore it has to be. It requires even better proof than it requires more substantial proof.
I would maintain that the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus is actually higher than a lot of skeptics are prepared to grant, and I did talk about this in the debate on Unbelievable as well. And the reason for that is because the crucifixion, ministry, life, resurrection of Christ is the culmination and climax of the Hebrew Bible. And so we have independent reason to think that God has plausible motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead. And so the prior probability is higher than if it was just some miscellaneous Joe Blow, right?
Well, it depends on whether you start out accepting that the Hebrew Bible paints a picture of the world that is consistent with the world that we actually experience. So I see no reason to conclude that there is a God out there behind the curtains winding the gears of the universe. And so if you want me to smuggle in accepting the Hebrew Bible, the answer to that's going to be a hard no until you've demonstrated that it has the same foundation for acceptance that this supposed resurrection has. So no, I don't agree that the Hebrew Bible is equally good grounds as external confirmatory evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, because I don't accept the Hebrew Bible either.
Okay, there's a few things to unpack there. First, you would concede that if God exists, that greatly increases the power probability, right?
Not necessarily, because if a God exists, no. So I don't want to misunderstand you. So let me be real careful, and you tell me which one of these you mean. Okay. So I don't necessarily agree that if a God exists, that gets us to the Hebrew Bible. Now, if you're asking me to grant, for the sake of the conversation, that there might be a God out there who potentially was, his picture was painted in the Hebrew Bible, we can use that as a foundation for a discussion. But I don't necessarily agree that any God concept necessarily requires me to accept the God of the Hebrew Bible.
But it does. But the existence of God does increase the power probability, because if there's a God who can raise Jesus from the dead, has the ability to do so, then that is relevant to the power probability, right?
No, I don't necessarily think that it does, because we're still questioning. There may be, and in fact are, many God stories that don't have resurrection of a Jesus of Nazareth. So proposing that there's a God out there that rose, that raised Jesus from the dead, well, that's fine. That doesn't necessarily increase the prior probability, because there are all kinds of God stories in which Jesus of Nazareth doesn't appear.
If there's a God who can raise Jesus from the dead, that even if I'm not saying that probability suddenly becomes like 1 or close to 1 or anything like that, but it does at least increase the probability somewhat, does it not?
I don't know. So let's not get caught up on this. I can hear Matthew.
I'm prepared to say yes to that.
Yeah,
question.
he's. I was going to say he's about to ring the bell on me, and he's got good reason to. I'm not necessarily convinced that it raises the prior probability, because you'd have to demonstrate that there was a God that not only could but had some reason to. Now, if you could demonstrate both of those things, I'd agree that we've raised the prior probability. But for the sake of the conversation, so that it can move forward, let's just answer full yes, so that we don't have to get bogged down in it.
Okay, I would agree, for the record, that if we can demonstrate that God not only exists but also has a plausible motivation for raising Jesus from the dead, then that increases the prior probability even further. But I think the existence of God in general also raises the prior probability at least somewhat. So anyway.
Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, like I said, I don't want to get bogged down there, though I do think that off mic that'd be a really interesting conversation to have. And maybe we can at some point, because this is interesting stuff for a certain kind of geek, right? And I guess we're all that kind of geek. So yeah. So we'll start there and just say yes, that gets the probability above zero. And Matthew, now I'm going to hand the mic back to you.
Oh, thank you. So you heat up the potato and then toss it to your mug of a tag team mate.
That is what I'm best at.
Okay. Right. So where we recap. Short answer: yes, Jonathan. I will accept that. The existence of a God makes it more likely that Jesus of Nazareth died and rose again. I will accept that as a proposition. I'm unconvinced by the existence of any God, but I will accept yes to that question. But I'd like to stick with the specifics of the resurrection, and my difficulty around the resurrection and the claims around that is quite rudimentary, really. It's to do with the age of the the event itself, going back however many centuries that it is. And the way that things were recorded at that time is not to the same reliability that we record things nowadays. So we can't judge those documents the same way that we would judge documents that we have that are only 20 years old. So I can't know that any of the specific itemized claims in the Gospels, and certainly those which have miracles in them, have any kind of accuracy at all. And that's my problem now. I've got no way of measuring the accuracy of any of those claims. I've got no way to cross-check them against anything. I've got no way of testing any of these claims because they're one-off past events. So my only option is to put them in the box of can't know, so can't accept.
So I would actually argue that the gospel accounts concerning the life of Jesus of Nazareth are very close up to the facts, and they're written either by apostles themselves or by people who were personally acquainted with apostles. And I think that we can cross-check numerous points of detail in the gospel accounts, and that when we can confirm and validate and corroborate numerous pieces of incidental detail in the Gospels, that provides itself inductive grounds for trusting the Gospel accounts as a whole as being reliable, substantially reliable documents. So just to take one example, in the Gospel of John chapter 12, we have Jesus' approach to Bethany. And in verse 1, it says, it gives us a particular timestamp that's extraneous or specific to the Gospel of John, not found in the Synoptic Gospel accounts. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. And Jesus stays overnight in Bethany on that occasion. And then the following day, verse 12, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, so they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel, and so forth. So there you have the triumphal entry. Notice that although that occasion is reported in all four of the Gospels, John's account alone is the Gospel which tells us the particular timestamp. This happened 6 days before Passover, and Jesus' triumphal entry was then the following day, making it 5 days before Passover. Not found in any other Gospel account. However, when we go over to the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 11, we also read the parallel account. This is verse 1. They drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives. Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, Go into the village in front of you. And immediately as you enter, it found a colt tied in which no one has ever sat, and tie it and bring it, and so forth. And so Mark actually telescopes the narrative, and that he doesn't tell us that Jesus actually arrived in Bethany the night before, and it wasn't until the morning that he sent the disciples to fetch the colt. However, we can actually count down the days in Mark's Gospel, which, assuming John's chronology to be correct. So remember, John told us that Jesus entered Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. If that is correct, then we get to verse 11 of Mark 11, and it said, He entered Jerusalem, went to the temple. When he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. That would make it the evening of 5 days before Passover, assuming the chronology of John to be correct. In verse 12, we read, On the following day, when he came from Bethany, he was hungry. That would make it the morning of 4 days before Passover, if John is correct. Verse 19, When evening came, they went out of the city. That would make it the evening of 4 days before Passover. Verse 20, As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withers away to its roots. That would make it the morning of 3 days before Passover. In Mark chapter 13, you have the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus has a conversation with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. So we can assume fairly, I think, that this is the evening of 3 days before Passover. In chapter 14, verse 1, it says, It was now 2 days before the Passover, exactly as you would expect, given the chronology that we find in the Gospel of John. That is a phenomenon known as an undesigned coincidence, which I think points to the veracity of the account. That particular extraneous detail is specific to John, that Jesus approached Bethany 6 days before Passover and rode into Jerusalem the following day. That is something which corroborates that specific detail. And when we have numerous instances of that, crisscrossing the gospel accounts, not only between the gospels themselves, but also between the gospels and external secular sources, that provides an inductive basis, I think, for trusting the gospel documents as a whole to be reliable.
Okay. So what you've done is you've got a passage here which is fairly detailed in some specifics, and as you quite rightly pointed out, quite consistent. And I'll accept all those on face value for that passage. My difficulty is, how do I know actually that it's all true? And sorry if it's that basic, but it really is. And I'm sure you've heard this before. People can write fiction that is equally consistent. So I'm not using that line to argue that this is necessarily fiction, but I'm using it to illustrate that I still don't know, and I've got no way to absolutely confirm it, because this passage could have bits right, it could have those days right, and it could have a meeting right, but we still don't know if the conversations that are reported are absolutely true. And there could still be details in there which could be absolute fiction, even though some of the framework is correct. And I just don't know.
Okay, so the argument is that this is an undesigned coincidence. So you not only have consistency, but you have consistency in an undesigned way. So it's not that John is using Mark and constructing it constructing his narrative in order to comport with Mark, because these fit together in an undesigned way. Notice that so John is the only gospel that tells us the 6 days before the Passover. You have different details between John and Mark suggesting that they're independent. For example, Mark telescopes the narrative. John expands on it a bit. Mark tells us that they arrive at Bethphage and Bethany, and then he sends the disciples to fetch the colt. John tells us actually they arrived the night before. It was in the morning that they get the colt. And these connections between, Mark doesn't even indicate explicitly that all of it discourse is happening in the evening, but it's inferred from the fact that the Mount of Olives is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is. And so when you put the pieces together, it fits together in a way that you would expect on the hypothesis of historicism, but doesn't fit in the way that you would expect if it was not grounded in historical events. Now, sure, I grant that finding a single historical detail in the Gospels is not sufficient on its own to demonstrate the substantial or general reliability of the Gospel accounts. However, when my argument is that we can find numerous examples of this sort of thing, not only where you have connections that fit together in an undesigned way between the Gospels, but also between the Gospels and external secular sources which verify and confirm it as well. And so that provides a prima facie basis on which to trust the Gospel accounts, even on instances where we cannot directly cross-check them, because the Gospels prove themselves time and again to be substantially reliable accounts.
I quibble with the substantially, because yes, there'll be bits that will be consistent across various bits, and that could either be collaboration or it could be people truthfully reporting events that happened independently. What it still doesn't tell me is it doesn't tell me all of the details in between all those. So I would quibble with the use of the word substantially there. But to move on, let's accept on face value the passage, was it from John that you read me earlier, from John 12? It reads to me and it sounds to me mostly like a normal event. There's nothing specifically spectacular happening there. It's just people meeting, people journeying, people having conversations. How do I get from the normality of life to, which is perfectly believable? I really don't have any reason to quibble over people having a conversation and people making a journey, whether I know that it happened or whether I don't know whether it happened, whether I can trust the document in front of me or whether I can't trust them. I have no reason to quibble over the normality of that. Where I quibble is where it gets to the unnormal or the supernormal or the supernatural, whatever phrase you want to use to use it. How do I get to that?
So the point is that because of the numerous examples which form a cumulative argument, we can demonstrate, or we have very good grounds to think, that the Gospels themselves are very close up to the facts. So this isn't someone that's writing down information, a generation later, removed from the facts, who that doesn't have reliable access to the facts in question. So to take one more example very quickly, if we go, I gave us this example in the debate in John chapter 6. In verse 5, you have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. It says, verse 5 says, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so these people may eat? Now, John's the only gospel to mention that to mention Philip's involvement in John chapter 6 and verse 5. That's not found in any other Gospels account, even though all four Gospels report this event. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 9, we have the parallel account of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And Luke tells us this incidental detail, which is not found in John, namely that the event took place in the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. And back in John's account, even though John 6 doesn't tell us exactly where Philip was from, we learn that in John chapter 12, where there are different contexts where there's some Greeks at the feast of Passover that want to see Jesus. They come to Philip to ask him if they can see Jesus. And it mentions in passing Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee. And so by putting the pieces together, we see, okay, so Jesus turns to Philip in John 6:5. We learn from John 12 that Philip's from the town of Bethsaida, but only in Luke's account do we learn that the event of the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in Bethsaida, even though Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all. And so, again, you have this pattern, which is best explained by John getting this very specific detail, namely which disciple Jesus spoke to on that particular occasion, correct. And so, again, as a cumulative argument, it suggests strongly, I think, that the gospel accounts are very close up to the facts and that they have reliable sources of information.
Is it possible for something to be reliable on things that are normal and expected and still fail to accurately report something that is spectacular? Absolutely
it is. But the point is that it gives a track record to the authors. So Luke in particular, Luke wrote a 2-volume set, the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, the Apostles. And Luke shows himself time and again to be an extraordinary historian, very, very accurate on matters of detail. I can give numerous examples to support that. And also in the Gospel of Luke, both Luke and Acts show really incredible levels of accuracy. And so that provides us with prima facie basis for trusting things that we cannot directly cross-check. When we show that the Gospel authors have a track record of reliable reportage, that then raises the probability of other things in the Gospels being correct.
I think the way I'd like to push back on that, broadly I accept what you're saying, but the caveat on my acceptance of that is if they can be reliable about people having a journey and people having a meeting and people meeting at a certain location, then I'm more likely to accept other descriptions of similar events. I accept it on that basis. I think it's when it then starts talking about things that are several steps removed from that kind of normality, that's where I would draw a line and say, actually, no, this is something that I need something better than just consistency on normality. I need something better in order for me to accept the non-normal.
And I guess that would come down to a difference in worldview perspective between us, because obviously I think that there's very compelling evidence to think that there's a God and that the material world is not all that exists. Whereas I presume that you believe that the natural world is all there is. And
yes, I do. You're right.
That's of course going to make a difference to our evaluation of the possibility of the supernatural.
Yes, I would accept that. So can I just finish this comment, Andrew? Then you can jump
please.
on. Yes, I do accept that. I think the caveat that I would say is, well, at this moment in time, I would quite happily accept the title of a hard materialist. That's not fixed for all eternity. You know, I could be persuaded to soften my stance on that. I was once, when I married my wife, we were both Christians. Now she's still a Christian, I'm not now. So I was once with you on that, and I moved away, and I'm not drawing the line. I could believe again, but and that's partly why I have conversations like that. So yes, there is a worldview difference, and yes, I am a hard materialist, but that could change. And so what I'm asking for is that thing that could make me change.
And so I guess I would want to point you in the direction of evidences for the existence of God, because obviously that's going to raise the probability of miracles significantly. And what sort of evidence would you accept for the existence of the miraculous?
That's a great question. Andrew, did you want to jump in with what you want to say? And then I'm quite happy to jump onto that line.
I do, because that is practically the perfect place to hand off the baton in this particular relay. Jonathan, I'm sorry. The next time you talk with us, if you're ever willing to again, you're welcome to bring a friend along, just so that it's not sort of unequal, because that's not the intent here. But I think for me, because we've talked just a little bit about Bayes, and again, I'm not trying to turn this into a mathematical discussion, but with your background in biology, you're familiar with scientific modeling just as one use of things like Bayes, right? So in the computer world, we would do something like make spam filters using something like Bayes. It's not necessarily the best modeling tool to use, but we might use Bayes. So it seems to me that there's a lot of talk today about modern day miracles, right? And if you've sort of suggested in your writing and on Unbelievable that Bayes was a good way to reach a more likely than not sort of analysis that the resurrection happened. Well, I think there's a good way to test that. And I wonder why the Christian community isn't doing this. If you really think Bayes is the answer to determining whether the resurrection actually happened, there are lots and lots of people who claim modern miracles today, and we have much better access to that evidence than we have through 2,000 years of handed off ancient text. Now, by the way, I'm not casting shade on whether the scholarship of the New Testament is reliable or not. It's not my point here, and so I don't want to be taken as being dismissive of scholarship. It's not the point. What I am saying is, if it is in fact the case that Bayes can reach back into the past and find a single event and somehow adjudicate whether a miracle actually happened, well, we've got lots of claims about modern miracles today. Why don't we take these same tools? Let's demonstrate that miracles are actually more likely than not, and then see if there's some retrospective way to apply it. Because right now, that's not being done. And as far as I can tell, I mean, you may be aware of some scholarship here that I'm not aware of, I am wholly unconvinced by that line of discussion because we're not making the most of these tools with things that we have direct access to today.
So I just have a couple of things to say.
Please.
Have you read Craig Keener's 2-volume set on miracles?
I read the second volume. I will just have to say that I haven't gotten through the first volume, and I think the second volume was something like 800 or 900 pages. I've got it here on my phone. I can look it up. Yeah. But so, yes, I didn't see any Bayesian analysis there.
Yeah. The point.
Am I missing it, or is there something that
you're right? The reason I brought that up is because he documents many examples of miracle claims without necessarily taking a position on their authenticity. But it does nonetheless undermine the stance that a lot of naturalistic atheists want to take, which is that miracles cannot happen or never happen in uniform human experience, because these are examples where people are claiming. And so one of the weaknesses of the David Humean argument is that it's circular, because it requires you to dismiss the whole argument, the pioneered by David Hume, requires you to dismiss these miracles are actually real, which is the very point under question.
I don't think that's quite Hume's point. So as far as I can tell, or at least the way I read Hume, is that he is simply saying it is always more likely than not that we are wrong because we are deceivable creatures than that a miracle actually occurred. So I'm not sure that. So I read you on Hume, and I'm not sure that we take Hume quite the same way.
But he does assume that miracles are outside of our human experience, outside of the human experience. Well,
so like I said, I don't think that's necessarily what he's saying. I think he's saying that whether miracles are part of our experience or not, it is always more likely that we have been deceived, because it is easier to deceive us than to perform a miracle. So we read Hume very differently there.
Another point I wanted to make was I would argue that we can look at apparently mundane events, which we can demonstrate historically, which in turn have implications for the reality of Christianity, for instance. So, for example, the fact that Jesus was crucified at the time of Passover, is a striking coincidence. And given its theological import, according to Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians 5 and other New Testament sources, Christ is the Passover lamb who's been slain for us, right? And you've got this concept of the Passover where the angel passes over the houses of the Hebrew families, and the houses that have the blood of the lamb smeared upon their doorposts are the ones that are spared. And if they don't have that blood on the doorpost, then the firstborn son gets slain as God's judgment. And so Christ becomes, in the New Testament theology, Christ becomes the fulfillment of that Passover symbolism. And so it's an interesting coincidence then that Christ's death happens to coincide with the time of Passover. It's not conclusive evidence for Christianity by any means, but it is striking. And I wrote an article on this. I call this the argument for Messianic convergence. And I basically I assigned what I think is a conservative Bayes factor of 50 to that correspondence. You can make the point that the time of Passover is a particularly likely time for a Jew to enter Jerusalem, for example. So I think it's skewed a little bit, but I think a Bayes factor of 50 is quite generous. And then you've got other compounding factors. So I mentioned earlier the evidence for the historicity of the claim in John 12 of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey 5 days before Passover, which, of course, correlates with Exodus 12, where the Jews were to select their Passover lamb and bring it into their homes on the 10th of Nisan, which is 5 days before Passover. And you've got other instances like the fact that Christianity becomes the dominant world religion that it becomes. So in the Old Testament, in various Old Testament passages like Isaiah 49, for example, or Isaiah 42, part of the Messiah's job description was to be a light for the nations, that God's salvation might reach the ends of the earth, that he would bring all nations, people from everywhere, every land, every language, to a recognition of the God of Israel. And that's been uniquely accomplished, of course, in the person of Christ. Now, on the hypothesis that Jesus is really the Messiah and that he really was sent from God, I think that the probability of that is significantly high on the basis of those prophecies. Whereas on the alternative, namely that Jesus is not the Messiah, that he's an imposter, then the probability is actually significantly less than that, especially on the basis of the fact that until 313 AD, when you had the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire, Christianity was a persecuted minority, and there were many emperors and Roman officials that tried to stamp out the Christian religion, destroy their people, destroy their scriptures, and so forth. So that seems to be significant Bayesian evidence for the truth of Christianity. You've got evidences from prophecy, which I think are also compelling and also raise the probability of the resurrection as well. And I think that what I just discussed in terms of these correspondences discussed as well, I think that these also raise the probability. I think that pertains to what William Lane Craig means when he talks about the theohistorical context. I think that's one way actually you can flesh that out a bit and argue for an elevated prior probability on the basis of these various correspondences that you see in Jesus' life with the Old Testament, which we can verify historically to be based on reality.
Yeah, so before we go much further down the trail of Bayes, I think it's worth pointing out that the models of Bayes that have been talked about thus far are all quite naive. So you've talked about assigning a prior probability of 50%. That's fine as far as it goes, and I think we're both willing. Well, I don't know if you are. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is very much so far a naive Bayesian kind of model.
When did I say I was assigning a probability of 50%? I don't remember saying that.
You did just at the beginning of this last paragraph. You said assigning a 50% probability, which I think is quite generous.
I didn't say that.
Oh, did I misunderstand you? My apologies.
What I said is a Bayes factor of 50. So,
yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Okay. No, that's fair enough. And my apologies for running with it in the wrong direction. But I think there's another problem with naivete in this particular kind of discussion that probably ought to be talked about just so that the audience has a picture in their mind of a potential problem here. So I'll use the spam filter as an analogy so that people can understand one of the problems with Bayes. If we were going to try to design a filter for email, right, and we were going to ask this Bayesian algorithm, we don't even have to talk about the algorithm in detail. We can just use the algorithm as a black box and say it is going to take the words in an email and decide based on those words whether the email is likely spam or likely not to be spam. Well, it's pretty easy to understand. But we know that that's not great in regard to language. because language has word dependence. There's a context, right? And so it's quite possible to have a pattern of words appear and it would be overly claimed as spam unless your model also accounts for building up a word context. Now, that's important in regard to the story that you're telling, because I don't think that in any sort of Bayesian analysis I've seen, there's a way to sort of account for the importance of context between details. And so what I have seen of your writing is a quite naive Bayesian model where each detail is supposed to just sort of stand on its own.
Oh, okay. So I can speak to that.
Are you with me? Do you see?
Yeah, I understand the objection.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the Bayesian analysis, as you quite rightly said, presumes independence of the facts that in question. And I actually, in my article where I develop the argument for messianic convergence, which I just discussed, where you have these correspondences between Jesus' life and the Old Testament, I actually take into account dependence between two episodes in particular. So one of them is Jesus' death at the time of Passover, and also its correspondence of Jesus entering Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, which is, of course, is not wholly independent of the Jesus' death at the time of Passover, because if it had turned out that Jesus enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover and he wasn't killed on the day of Passover, then that correspondence would be lost on us. So if we take his entry into Jerusalem on Nisan 10th to be significant, we have to be assuming that he died right around that time, which means that one entails the other. So the question that we want to ask then is how much additional evidence provides that Jesus also entered Jerusalem on Nisan 10th. And as I said earlier, also another factor for us to consider is that Passover is a particularly likely time for a Jew to enter Jerusalem, and also a time when he could count on ministering to a large crowd of people who made their pilgrimage to Judea for the feast. And one might also object, of course, that a possible explanation of that coincidence is Jesus himself, seeing himself as the fulfillment of the Passover lamb, deliberately entered Jerusalem on Nisan 10th. I have two responses to that. And one is that if Jesus falsely saw himself as messianic, it's far more likely that he would have perceived himself to be a military leader like Simon Bar Gura or someone, or who would lead a revolt against the Roman occupiers, not suffer a humiliating death by crucifixion. And my second response is that the appropriate issue to concern ourselves with is the striking coincidence that it was precisely on the year in which Jesus entered Jerusalem 5 days before Passover that his death by crucifixion coincidentally took place on the day of Passover. Now, to be conservative on that particular point, I only assign a base factor of 2 to that fact. So that thereby accounting for the dependency between those two examples. But notice that a base factor of 2 doubles your cumulative base factor. So it is dependent, but it nonetheless contributes additional evidence to your hypothesis.
Right. So I don't think I came across that particular article. And so I don't think I can talk about it in great detail because I don't think that's the article I read. But I still don't fundamentally see, sort of rewinding to, probably 20 or 25 minutes ago now, I don't fundamentally see how any Bayesian analysis, regardless of compatibility of natural detail, adjudicates a miraculous event. So history can only ever record those things that people believe happen, not the thing that actually happens. We talked about eyewitness testimony up front. It's notoriously unreliable. And so we can have, and I think Matthew mentioned this earlier, we can have compatible natural detail. It doesn't get us to a miracle. And it doesn't get us to a miracle because we have no way to know that natural law was broken. We don't have a way to assign some action to a God. We haven't demonstrated that a God exists. So we're going to have to get past that hurdle at some point. How does natural detail adjudicate breaking of natural law, Bayesian or not?
Well, obviously, I would have to disagree that we haven't shown that God exists, because I think there's really good, compelling evidence, even from my own discipline of biology, to think that there's a God.
Happy to talk about that. In fact, if you'd like, we have a friend of the show, Professor Brian Blaze. He has a PhD in physics with an emphasis in neurobiology. and it'd be very interesting to have the two of you in conversation. Now, I can't speak for Brian, so I don't know if he'd be willing to. And I'll just say for the listeners, you're a biologist and I'm not. So in the same way that I expect I could lose you in a conversation about programming, I have no doubt that you can snow me in 4 or 5 minutes in biology. But my understanding is that most biologists are not also theologians. And so on balance, I think there's good reason to suspect that whatever you would say in regard to biology, we can find experts who will easily disagree and perhaps more experts. So I hate the argument from, I hate that sort of fallacy, right? The argument from expertise, but I can't follow you in biology because I'm not a biologist.
Yeah, but the point is that, of course, we're going to disagree on that point. So my adjudication of prior probability is going to be different from yours on that front.
Sure. At some point, we've got to demonstrate how compatibility of natural events gets us to a miracle, I think was really the substantial point that I was trying to make.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, it's an inductive argument from numerous points of historical confirmation in the Gospels, then provides prima facie reason for trusting the Gospels on those things on which we cannot directly cross-check them. I don't rule out the miraculous a priori. I look at the evidence, and if the Gospels show themselves to be close up to the facts, substantial, reliable, habitually truthful accounts, then on numerous points of detail, then I think that's a good basis for trusting them on things I can't directly check them on. Secondly, I mentioned the numerous correspondences between the gospel portrayals and presentations of Jesus' life in the Old Testament, where we have cases where we not only have strong historical support for individual details, but these details happen to be, in several cases, or many cases, precisely the point at which the New Testament portrayals of Jesus' life corresponds or correlates with the Old Testament in a way that points away from mere coincidence and towards design. And yet it's not designed the part of the human author, because we know from history that these events really happened in the way the Gospels describe, on the relevant details at least. And so then that points towards the divine design hypothesis. And so, of course, that provides the theo-historical context, which I think significantly and substantially raises the prior probability of Jesus of Nazareth being raised from the dead.
Yeah, I heard all the word, and you haven't gotten me any closer. Now, I realize the first thing you would think is that's just a skeptic being unwilling to move. I don't think so. And the reason is that we have all sorts of coincidence in natural events. And now I know that you're going to claim that the type-anti-type relationship is much stronger than mere coincidence. I get that. I would say that that's probably your bias, whereas you would say, I'm just calling it coincidence and that's my bias. So it's going to be a worldview difference. But coincidence of relationship doesn't equal miraculous event.
Okay, good. Let me ask you a question. So
sure.
Would you concede at least that the coincidence of Jesus' death falling on Passover, given the theological import of that, is more probable on the truth of Christianity than on its falsehood?
Let me answer it two ways. So let me answer yes to exactly the way you asked the question. Okay, and so I don't want to dodge. I hate podcasts where someone's asked a direct question and they dodge. The way you've asked the question, the answer is yes. But the problem that I have is that we don't even have the year that Jesus died. So, I'm not a mythicist. Okay, so I'll go on record. I have friends who are mythicists. I'm not a mythicist. But we don't even have the year that he died nailed down. And so I'm not sure that when you say on or near Passover, we're talking about, I'm not sure that we're talking about something concrete enough to convince me. So what is near Passover? Is 4 days near? Is 10 days near? Is a month near? Now, I'm not going to get more ridiculous than that, because, we could get absurd as 3 months near, as 6 months near. But I am not convinced that we know enough to even call it near in the sense that would allow me to accept the answer that I gave first.
Well, Jesus wasn't just crucified near Passover, but specifically on the day of Passover. And that's recorded in all four Gospels. And the Passion narratives, I would argue, are independent of one another. And also, the Gospels are substantially reliable, as demonstrated by numerous points of historical confirmation.
But there's a lot of disagreement over that, right? So,
yeah.
Okay.
But I've also evaluated that disagreement carefully. So there's numerous... The Jesus' death at the time of Passover is intricately connected to various points of detail in the gospel. For example, when in John 19:31, for example, says, since it was a day of preparation, so the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. So John just calls the following Sabbath a high day, meaning it wasn't just any ordinary Sabbath day, but a special feast day. You've also got the fact that the Jews were concerned about entering Pilate's dwelling because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. In John 18:28, it says, and they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. And so that detail is integrally interwoven with the Passover. The fact that Jesus enters Bethany 6 days before Passover, enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, according to John 12, is also presupposes the Passover, and I already showed why that historical detail can be trusted. So you've got these numerous details that it seems that you cannot divorce the gospel accounts concerning Jesus' death from it being at the time of Passover.
Okay, so and yet there are people as well educated on this particular topic as you are who don't find this reliable. And so I know that you've said, you verified this for yourself. I would never suggest that you were not scrupulously honest about the conclusion that you reached. But however you reach your conclusion, there does seem to be wide room for disagreement, right? Well, there is at least some room for disagreement that you acknowledged yourself. How wide that is not something that I can weigh in on. So, yeah, I just don't know how to take what you've said and cause that to equal a miracle, or to be confirmation of a resurrection miracle.
The point is that it raises the probability of the resurrection because
I don't think it does.
It provides a theohistorical context where you have these correspondences with the Old Testament, which are not the product of human design, not the product of, or less likely to be product of coincidence, and therefore that provides that significantly, I think, raises the probability of the resurrection hypothesis.
I don't. So I'll say again that I don't see any way for a set of natural events to raise the prior probability of a supernatural event. I'll keep saying that because you keep talking about raising the prior probability, and what we haven't gotten to is this gets us to a miracle. And now I know you're saying it raises the prior probability. I get that. I don't think it does. Confluence of natural events doesn't, in any way that I can distinguish, suggest that natural law has been broken. And it's not just in the Christian tradition, because presumably you know who Sai Baba is. Are you, would you say that that Sai Baba worked miracles? Probably not.
No, because Sai Baba has actually been exposed to be a con artist.
Mm-hmm. And what we have here is 2,000 years of intervening time. And I know that you sincerely believe what you're saying. I don't have any question that that's the case. But the scholarship, it's not only not unanimous on these points, we're not close to unanimity. And so I don't know how to adjudicate it further than that, except to say that if you expect that there are miracles, we ought to be able to do a lot better job than simply say this thing happened 2,000 years ago. Right? I mean, seriously, as an individual, if you believe in miracles, wouldn't you expect to be able to reliably point to miracles?
Well, here's a detail where you can look at historical events or natural historical events, which I think point to the miraculous, and that is fulfilled predictive prophecy. So would you accept that in principle as evidence of a miracle?
It's not the kind of miracle we're talking about. So this is sort of equivocation now. The sorts of miracles that we started out talking about were raising the dead. Presumably you accept water to wine, that Jesus fed the 5,000, that he cast out demons, that he healed an issue of blood by a woman touching his garment. I mean, that's the sort of substantial daily intervention that I think we're talking about. And I am asking for a reliable mechanism to show that those things are possible for themselves, not through reading the tea leaves of natural events. And if we can't get there, I think I'm with Matthew. Why should I be convinced?
Well, the reason I brought up predictive prophecy is because if that argument can be shown to carry validity, carry evidential weight, then surely that in itself raises the prior probability of the resurrection and makes it more believable. And so it undermines yet further the rejection of the resurrection on the basis of a naturalistic commitment.
That's not actually my position at this point. No, yes, I don't think resurrection is likely. I've given the reason. Right now, we're engaged in a base rate fallacy because you're claiming this one-off event. As far as I can tell, we don't have any evidence of things like resurrections. We walk around daily and we don't see physical resurrections. Now, you claimed, and I agree, that it may not be logically inconsistent. But logical inconsistency is not the issue that's actually on the table between us, I don't think. The issue on the table between us is whether it is physically possible. And so surely it is reasonable to simply say, we need a demonstration.
But the whole point is that it's not physically possible. That's why it has evidential significance when it comes to verifying, validating the messianic credentials of Jesus. Because if miracles and resurrections were happening on a daily basis, then they would lose their evidential significance because they wouldn't be so vastly more probable on the hypothesis of a supernatural intervention versus a naturalistic phenomena.
I entirely disagree. The prevalence of an event, a one-off, is much harder to accept. In fact, that's part of the issue of this conversation. Is a one-off event is much harder to accept than an event that is repeatable and verifiable. And so we've got a fundamental, we're at loggerheads over that very idea. You want me to accept, sorry, that's too editorially strong. The Christian position is that we should accept there was a resurrection of a Savior 2,000 years ago. I am not necessarily suggesting that there has to be a resurrection of a Savior every generation, but we do need to be able to verify that this resurrection is possible.
Yeah, I think we're at an impasse at that point.
No, it's fair enough. Matthew, I promised I'd give the mic back, and I took it away from you.
No, that's fine. We're pretty much on the same page on most things. So whatever you say is just my words with a different accent, I think.
I am so sorry.
There's a couple of things I'd like to pick up on. The Passover. Yeah, you mentioned there's a little bit of discrepancy and you found a way to resolve it. For me, from a spiritual perspective, I understand the significance of Jesus being crucified on the Passover, or even the Passover weekend being a day either side. Quite honestly, makes little difference to me. But in terms of the narrative of the gospel and stitching the Old Testament to the New Testament, I get the significance of the Passover because it links it to Egypt and the exodus of Joseph's descendants, and that is significant. But for me, looking at it as a skeptic, I can also see that if you're going to write a fictional narrative, it is also a very powerful tool to use to knit together your story. So for me, the timing of that event has no convincing, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't trigger me either way, because it could just as easily be true as untrue, if that makes sense.
So what I'd say to that is, first of all, I think we do have good historical attestation to that event falling on the day of Passover. And so I think that points away from the human design hypothesis. And secondly, I don't think that particular piece of evidence on its own carries the weight of Christianity, but is part of a cumulative case which I think there are numerous points of these convergences between the New Testament portrayals of Jesus' life and the Hebrew Bible, and which we can both confirm historically and which I think point away from mere coincidence.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's I wanted to talk more about cumulative case, but I'm looking at the time. We're an hour and a half in, and I don't think we'll do it justice. But I guess we can try. I struggle with cumulative case, and the reason for me, and it goes back to the question you asked me a few moments ago about what would it take me to believe. I get small pieces of evidence for something ordinary and something normal. I don't get small pieces of evidence for something that's major and significant. And to use a really twee example, I've got a black Honda Jazz that's 15 years old in my garage downstairs. And I'm pretty sure that you have no difficulty whatsoever in accepting what I just said is true, because why would I lie about such mundane details? And lots of people drive 15-year-old Jazzes, and a lot of them are black. So what's to quibble about those details? Plus, those details are of little significance to you. But if I was to say that it can also go on water, you would probably stop at that point and go, actually, I might need to see the car or see a photo or see some still. So that's the quibble that I have with cumulative cases. Little details for normal things I'm absolutely fine with. And the other thing that you and Andrew were just talking about was miracles and occurrences of miracles. And you mentioned Craig Keener's massive 2 volumes. And I've had discussions with miracles on another podcast. Robert White, lovely chap. He and I had a conversation on miracles, which went on to his podcast, and also a friend of ours, Dale's podcast. And my difficulty with miracles is those that I've had the opportunity to look into, and I haven't read Keener's books, but I have read some of his accounts, those that I can find, and I've read some of the reviews and investigations that people have done on those. And I am unconvinced by the details of those that I've seen. And when Robert and I were having a conversation about miracles, again, we talked about a couple of cases. We didn't go exhaustively into them, but we did talk about a couple of cases. And in each of those ones that I've looked at, I haven't had enough information to be able to say, okay, yeah, I accept this as a miracle. And that's my problem there. And on the subject of worldviews, I have a concern that some Christians are too ready to believe a claim of a miracle on just the testimony alone. And I've got a very personal story about that. I won't go into all of the details. When Brian Blaze was on Andrew's and my on this podcast, Still Unbelievable, with Andrew and myself a few months ago, I told this story in much greater detail. Basically, in a nutshell, it concerns my mother. I grew up in a missionary environment in Zambia, so my family grew up in Zambia. 40 years ago, my mother was kidnapped for most of a day. And at her funeral 10 years ago, the minister stood up and he told the story of his life, as people do at funerals. And he told very briefly the story of her kidnapping, missing out the most appalling details, obviously. But he did include this little snippet that when she'd been kidnapped, the church got together and prayed, and there was a clap of thunder and the people let her go. Now, that little part is factually untrue. It's a fabrication, and I have no idea where it came from. I can only guess it came from my stepfather, my mother's second husband, who met her 10 years after the event. But I don't know how that inaccuracy got into the testimony, got passed on to the minister to tell. And I know it's inaccurate because I was 9 years old when this happened, and I've grown up through my life this event being talked about, and that particular thing was never mentioned. And I've also got in my belongings my mother's account of that event, which she wrote 10 years afterwards. And this whole thing about the miracle, the miraculous event and the people praying isn't mentioned in there at all. So I'm absolutely certain that that particular moment is a fiction, but everything else that was told about my mother's life was true. So if you're going to judge that event on the fact that everything else was true, you're making a grave error. And it genuinely hurts me that there's a church in the UK that my mother spent her final years at that believes this miracle that never happened, because of the environment in which they heard it. So that causes me concern, but also actually it's quite hurtful to know that this, I'm going to say lie, it exists out there, but I'm very prepared to accept that it wasn't intentionally a lie. Somehow it crept in, and how it crept in is irrelevant. It's just untrue. So my concern is going back to the relevance of these miraculous events in the Gospels and things like that. I find it much easier to believe that in amongst this narrative of things that people got up to, there are miraculous narratives that came in intentionally or unintentionally. And what we see now is the evolvement of this seeping in of supernatural events coming in to create a story that we have now.
Okay, I just have a few things to say on the points that you raised. As for Craig Keener's 2-volume set on miracles, the reason I brought that up was because in relation to David Hume's objection to miracles, where he basically says that miracles lie outside the realm of repeated human experience, well, for his argument to hold in that regard, he has to dismiss these miracle claims. I'm not vouching for the veracity of those individual miracle reports, but nonetheless, his argument has to dismiss those as being unreliable or fabricated, which is the whole point that his argument is trying to establish, that miracles are outside the realm of human experience, or that miracles cannot be rationally believed in on the basis of them falling outside the realm of uniform human experience. On the car analogy issue, I completely agree that different claims require different levels of evidence depending on the prior probability. And I'm not saying that the claim that you have a car is got an equivalent prior probability to the hypothesis that Jesus was raised supernaturally from the dead. I do claim that there is sufficient evidence to overcome the initial low prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus. And I don't necessarily think that the prior probability of the resurrection is as low as many skeptics believe it to be. And on the final point about the story with your mother, I'm sorry to hear about that experience, but and I do not contest that there are some miracle reports that are fabricated deliberately, or where people have misguided interpretations of experiences, etc. But we have to evaluate and adjudicate these on a case-by-case basis. One fabricated miracle report doesn't necessarily mean that other miracle reports are fabricated.
And yes, and on that final point, I would agree. I think my difficulty is that those that I've looked into, because I mentioned I looked at some examples, and the internet isn't the font of all information, but from the information that I can glean, I've looked at a few dozen claims of miracles. I haven't found one where there's enough information for me to be able to say I accept. So while I don't reject them because I know one is false, I don't accept any of the ones I've looked at because I haven't seen enough to get me over that line. And because I've got 100% failure rate on those that I've looked into to get me over the line, I'm increasingly lowering my prior probability of those that I'm prepared to accept, if you see what I mean.
Okay.
I don't know if that's answered your question on what would it take for me to believe. I'm going to try and answer that as quickly and as shortly as I can. I don't know specifically is the short answer to that. What it would need to be is something that I'm going to use that word, scientifically analyze. That's probably not the right way to phrase it, but something that can be established to be non-explainable naturally. So therefore, the only conclusion I could come to would be God. But it would have to be more than just a rationally reached conclusion. I would want some kind of, I'm going to say experiment. Experiment's possibly not the right word, but I'm going to use it as a place marker for something better. But I'm going to need to have some kind of experiment that would be able to be done and done again, which would result in, yes, there is the Christian God. I don't know what that would be, but it would have to be a Joshua style thing, I would imagine, where I could say, okay, this is God, then this is the result that's expected, and it happened. Okay, let me try that again to prove the idea. So it would need to be something like that. I'm fairly sure that a Damascus Road type event wouldn't do it for me, because I would probably just assume I had a drink spiked or something like that.
Matthew, do you mind if I tie on to that?
Okay, go for it.
So, Jonathan, I've said this on a number of our podcasts, and I think I'd like to say it to you in regard to what it would take to get me to believe, because I accept that you're a rational guy and a clear thinker, and I'd really like a Christian response if you're willing and you find it something worthy of engaging in. The thing that bothers me about New Testament miracles, raising someone from the dead, turning water to wine, feeding the 5,000, or healing the sick and the lame and the blind. The problem with all of those things is that they don't seem to get to the core of the things that Christianity really wants me to accept. And here are those things: that there's a God that lives outside space and time, that he has the ability to live forever, whatever that might mean, that he does or does not maintain an eternal torture chamber for those that do right and wrong, that he has the capacity to rightly divide the just from the unjust in a perfect way, that he can grant eternal life even if he does himself live forever. Can he grant it to others? And the list sort of goes on, that there is a soul, that he doles out souls as humans come into being. So those are all of the claims that are being asked to be accepted on the back of things like turning water to wine. And I hope that we can agree that the ability to perform some act, you can use something mundane, like putting a man on the moon, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we should be able to do something else, like prevent humans from being subject to viruses. I don't just mean COVID-19, SARS, MERS, the common cold, whatever. And so my problem is that even if we could get to the point where we said, yes, there was a guy resurrected from the dead, that wouldn't necessarily require that there was a God out there that could live forever or do any of the rest of it. And so those things would have to be demonstrated to my satisfaction, regardless of or without respect to the claims made in the New Testament.
But the resurrection of Jesus does provide evidence for these things. In other words, it's more probable than, it raises the probability of these things. Jesus himself made many claims concerning the afterlife, concerning his identity, and he was asked on numerous occasions for evidence for his divine and messianic self-identity. And Jesus, of course, was an evidentialist, and he's approached, for example, in Matthew chapter 11 by disciples sent from John the Baptist in prison, and they ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Also in John 2, after Jesus cleanses the temple, the Jews ask him in verse 18, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." In other words, the resurrection is evidence for his divine and messianic self-identity, and thus is evidence for the veracity of the claims that he made.
So I will ask you this directly then. Are you suggesting that our ability to, so following the parallels here, are you suggesting that our ability to put a man on the moon raises the prior probability that we will someday break the speed of light?
No, I don't. But
that's my point.
Yeah, the point is that if God did in fact raise Jesus from the dead, then he presumably had reason for vindicating Jesus of Nazareth, and that would include vindicating his claims, which would include his messianic and divine self-identity. And also the Old Testament in Isaiah 53 and elsewhere forecasts ahead of time the resurrection of Jesus. And so the fact that he was raised from the dead is then very strong evidence that he is in fact the Jewish Messiah.
But you did just agree that in a much more mundane case, the ability to put a man on the moon said nothing about our ability to do anything else. And so while I accept that you think it raises the prior probability, when we went to something that was very mundane, you were quite willing to say that the ability to do one didn't say anything about the other necessarily, that it didn't change the prior probability at all. Well, okay, wait a minute. You didn't say that directly. That's what I took from it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth because that's a most unfair way to conduct conversation. But you see the problem, right? It's the ability to raise someone from the dead, if you could, wouldn't necessarily say that you could do all of those other things. And you seem to agree with that in the realm of the mundane.
Except the example you gave is not wedded to a theo-historical context, as is the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And it's not only the resurrection which we are to contend with, but also the fulfillment of these messianic prophecy in the Old Testament, which I also think points to Christ, or to Jesus being the Messiah.
Which still says nothing about whether there's a God that can live forever, whether he can invent universes, whether he has the ability to judge the righteous from the sinners, to maintain an eternal torture chamber, et cetera, which are all of my issues going in.
Okay, I would have to disagree. I think it does raise the probability that God exists, and also I think we have independent evidence from the natural sciences, both the physical and life sciences, for the existence of God as well.
But it still doesn't get to he can live forever, he can create universes, he maintains or doesn't maintain an eternal torture chamber.
You're right in the sense that it doesn't provide a deductive basis. So there's no deductive logical argument which gets you there from the resurrection of Jesus. However, the resurrection of Jesus does provide good evidence for those things.
Okay, so are you willing to say then that in the mundane case, the ability to put a man on the moon somehow creates an inductive case for other non-related things that we might do in the future? The ability to...
because that's the key word. The key word is non-related, and the things that you mentioned are not non-related.
But that has to be proven, because as far as I can tell, they are non-related.
No, because of the theo-historical framework that I talked about.
Yeah, So it's a worldview issue, and the thing that we pride ourselves on not doing is having a conversation turn, and I don't do that. I'm willing to leave it if you are at. We have a difference of perspective on whether that context raises the prior probability of some God out there that can do all of those things, based on the fact that the prior probability of the ability to live forever or to maintain an eternal torture chamber or not, those things are more likely. The prior probability is raised because someone was raised from the dead. Yeah, I'm willing to leave it that we just don't see eye to eye on that.
I think we're probably at an impasse at that point because of our difference in worldview perspective.
Sure, fair enough. Matthew, was that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. You're an absolute gentleman, Jonathan. Thank you for coming on. And I'll beat Andrew later.
Hey, that wasn't too bad, right?
You're fine. Jonathan, I watched your phone call to, was it the Atheist Experience a year ago, 18 months ago, and you were very much a gentleman there too, and they gave you a hard time. I hope we've not been quite so hard then. I kind of take the same view as them, but I hope I've been nicer than they were. You were, they gave you a bit of a, they were quite harsh, weren't they?
Was that the one with Don Baker and Jenna Belk, where they raised skepticism about whether the apostles existed?
They were very firm with you.
Yeah, they were pretty out in La La Land with some of their conspiracy theories about the apostles never existing, and just really weird stuff.
I wouldn't quite go as far as call it a conspiracy theory. I'm almost there with them. I wouldn't say it in the way that they'd say it, but I'm almost there in the sense that I read the Bible and I read it as a text, but I don't know how to get from there to actual history. I'm almost there.
Just to clarify, are you a mythicist?
I don't know if I'm truly honest. I obviously reject the miracle accounts. It's where I go next after that, and how much more do I reject after I've rejected the miracles. So I haven't fully decided on where I stand on the historicity of Jesus. Did he really exist, and was he really crucified? He just didn't do the miracles, or is he an amalgamation of other characters? I genuinely don't know where to go on that, and I suspect that I'll never be able to decide because I'll never have enough information to do that.
Okay.
Sorry, that was quite skillfully dodged, wasn't it? but on a lot of these things, I pretty much take that view of I don't know enough, and so it's a bit naive of me to say this is what I think happened.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. I said right at the very beginning there was a question I wanted to ask you, which has been submitted to me from a Christian, because she was very interested in the conversation that I was going to have about you, and she was very interested to hear that you were very hot on apologetics. So the question that I've been submitted to ask you directly is, if you stripped away all of the supporting arguments from apologetics, would you still believe in the truth of the resurrection, and why?
No, absolutely, I wouldn't, because then I would have no rational warrant for believing the resurrection to be based on a historical event. And I believe that one should only believe things for which they have rational warrant.
Thank you for that. I take it to mean then that experience isn't good enough for you, that you need to be able to justify what you believe beyond having, having a spiritual experience.
Yeah, exactly. So the Mormons claim to have a burning in the bosom. I don't think that is a veridical experience. I don't think it's truth attesting, and I prefer to base things on objective, publicly accessible evidence rather than subjective experience.
Thank you. It's interesting to say, because in my past I was part of a charismatic church at one point, and I had quite a dramatic deliverance experience, and that was quite traumatizing at the time. And so when I eventually decided to bail on Christianity, that's probably not the right phrase, but when I deconstructed my faith, that was one of the first questions that was asked me. It says, well, how do you explain that experience? And, how can you possibly give up on your faith when you've had that enormous experience? And it turns out I can.
Okay.
Thank you. Was there anything you wanted to ask of Andrew and myself before we let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening?
No, I don't think so. I'm curious as to what the specific issue was that caused you to abandon Christianity in the first place, if you want to share.
Okay, yes, it was a combination of things, but it was science that dragged me out. For many, many years, because of my upbringing in a missionary environment, I was brought up as a young earth creationist, and so brought that young earth creationism into my adult Christian faith. And it was as an adult, and actually, funny enough, discovering podcasts that exposed me to more scientific information. And it wasn't very long before I realized that actually evolution was true, and it was acceptable. And so as I got more and more convinced by the evidence of evolution, I found my faith being more and more challenged. And over a period of 3 years, I found that I was unable to I nearly said resurrect there. I was unable to save my faith, or to rebuild my faith as something else. I think I was just so literalistic in the way that I'd been brought up that there wasn't anything to salvage once I'd accepted evolution, and it pretty much died on that cross.
Okay.
So, I don't know if you wanted me to answer that as well, or
sure, if you want to.
Well, it's entirely up to you. It's your question. Okay. I think early on, as I was leaving, I worked for an apologetics company, actually, and they were young earth creationists. I was quite disillusioned with that particular approach to dealing with science. I don't think we handled it honestly, and I think the whole 6,000 or 5 to 10,000, whatever it is, I think it's much less likely than not. So that started the problem, and sin and suffering is obviously a big problem for a lot of skeptics. I'll say that I share those concerns, though it started with young earth creationism. And moving from that, I have a problem with Christian claim to objective truth. And so there's sort of a three-pronged issue for me with Christianity. And while they didn't all happen at the same time, they are the three things that today would all have to be handled for me to go back. Not necessarily young earth creationism, but a consistent view of science, a better answer to sin and suffering, and some way to deal with the Christian claim of objective truth when it is pretty apparent to me that objectivity is only had after we have agreement about a goal. There you are. And if you'd like to come back and talk about any of those, you're always welcome back.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to.
So, Okay, well, if you really would like to, we'll set it up for some point in the future, because I think we'd both be interested to hear what you have to say.
Sure.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been a genuine pleasure having you on. Thank you for the challenge and the conversation. Hopefully it kept the right tone for everybody else. There was, as all these things go, it didn't always go how the way I anticipated, but we covered a bit of Bayes and we covered a bit of the cumulative case, which was what I hoped for. Listeners, if there's anything that you want to be covered in more detail, get back. It turns out that 2 hours gets swallowed really, really quickly. Thank you, Jonathan. Genuine gentleman. And until the next episode, good night. You have been listening to a podcast by Reason Press. To get in touch, email reasonpress@gmail.com or see our website, reasonpress.net, where you'll also find our book, Still Unbelievable. We welcome more feedback, and you might even end up on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. You can hear more of her music at soundcloud.com/hollybishop. You can support us by buying some of Holly's music and telling her we sent you.